Lady Chatterley's lover. Ours is essentially a tragic age, so we refuse to treat it tragically. We still have to live, no matter how many skies have fallen in. And this was, more or less, Constance Chatterley's position, for the war had brought the roof down over her head. She'd married Clifford Chatterley in 1917, when he was home for a month on leave. He was 29. Constance was then 23. He was shipped back to England again 6 months later, more or less in pieces. For 2 years he remained in doctors' hands, after which he was pronounced cured. He could return to life again, but with the lower half of his body from the hips down paralysed forever. This was in 1920. Together they returned to his ancestral home, Ragby Hall, the family seat. Clifford was now a baronet. Constance was now Lady Chatterley. He was not really downcast, for he could wheel himself about in a wheelchair, or he could use a motorised bath chair. But he remained strange, almost bright and cheerful. Constance was a country girl, ruddy-looking with soft brown hair and a sturdy body, full of unusual energy. Ragby Hall was a long, low, old house in brownstone, which had been begun in the middle of the 18th century and added on to, until it had become a warren of a place without distinction. Its park overlooked Teversham village, which, with its pit chimneys, started a trail of utterly hopeless ugliness for a long, gruesome mile. Houses, rows of wretched, small, begrimed brick houses with black slate roofs and sharp angles of wilful, blank dreariness. With a stoicism characteristic of the young, Connie took in this soulless desolation of the coal and iron Midlands at a glance, and left it at what it was, unbelievable and not to be thought about. Clifford professed to like Ragby Hall better than London. He liked this county, which had a grim will of its own, and its people who had guts. Connie wondered what else they had. Certainly neither eyes nor minds. The people were as haggard, shapeless and dreary as the countryside, and just as unfriendly. There was no communication between Ragby Hall and Teversham village. None. The colliers merely stared at them. The gulf was impassable, fuelled by a quiet resentment on either side. Connie hardened herself to this steady drizzle of resentment, but it was not that she and Clifford were unpopular. They merely belonged to an entirely different species from the colliers. And yet the village sympathised with Clifford and Connie in the abstract. Clifford was extremely shy and self-conscious, now he was lame. He hated to see anyone other than their personal servants. He was rather supercilious and contemptuous of anyone not in his own class, standing his ground without any attempt at conciliation. Connie and he were attached to one another. He was a hurt thing, and as such, Connie stuck to him passionately. But she could not help feeling how little connection he really had with people. He was only remotely interested in the miners, like a man looking down a microscope or up into a telescope. He was not in touch. Even Connie felt that she herself didn't really, not really touch him. Yet he was absolutely dependent on her. He needed her every moment. Big and strong as he was helpless. Alone, he was like a lost thing. He needed Connie to be there, to assure him he existed at all. She had to superintend the house, but it seemed to be run by mechanical anarchy. No warmth of feeling united it. The hall seemed as dreary as a disused street, so she left it alone. Connie and Clifford had spent nearly 2 years at Ragby Hall, living a vague life absorbed in Clifford and his writing. It was a life in a void. Although Ragby was there and the servants, it was spectral, as though it did not really exist. Connie went for walks in the park and woods and enjoyed their solitude and mystery. But it was all a dream. It had no substance for her. No touch, no contact. Only this endless life with Clifford. Time passed, but whatever happened, nothing happened. She was completely out of contact. She and Clifford lived through their ideas and his books. This despite the fact she entertained continually. There were always people in the house. Connie was aware of her growing restlessness that twitched her limbs when she didn't want to twitch them. A mad restlessness that made her heart beat violently for no reason. And she was getting thinner. Vaguely, she knew she was moving away from reality. Her father advised her, "Why don't you get yourself a good man friend, Connie? Do you all the good in the world." That winter, a young Irishman called Michaelis, who had made a rather large fortune in America from his plays, came to stay for a few days. He obviously wasn't an Englishman, in spite of all that the best tailors, hatters, barbers and cobblers of London had done. He desired to be where he didn't belong, among the English upper classes, and how they enjoyed the various jibes they aimed at him, and how he hated them. There was something about him that Connie liked. He didn't put on airs. He had no illusions about himself. "It's wonderful what you've achieved at your time of life," commented Clifford contemplatively. "And are you alone?" asked Connie. "How do you mean? Do I live alone?" "No, I've got my servant. I'm going to marry, for I must marry." "You make it sound like you're going to have your tonsils out," laughed Connie. "Will it be so much of an effort?" He looked at her admiringly. "Well, Lady Chatterley, somehow I feel it will. I know I can't marry an Englishwoman, so I've asked my man if he will find me a Turk or something." Connie wondered at this odd, somehow melancholy specimen of extraordinary success. She felt a sudden, strange leap of sympathy for him, mingled with such compassion, tinged with repulsion. But it almost amounted to love. Michaelis knew at once he'd made an impression on her. He knew just where he was with Clifford, but with his wife he was not quite so sure. The next morning, Michaelis was flattered by being asked up to Lady Chatterley's own sitting room. "It's very pleasant up here," he remarked as he went in. Connie and Michaelis sat on opposite sides of the fire and talked. She asked him about his relatives. Michaelis replied frankly. "Why are you such a lonely bird?" Connie asked him suddenly. He looked at her searchingly. "Some birds are made that way," he explained. "But look here, what about yourself? Aren't you something of a lonely bird yourself?" Connie, startled, thought about it for a few moments, and then she replied, "Only in a way, not altogether like you." "You're quite right," Michaelis responded. He looked up at her with a full glance that saw everything and registered everything. "May I hold your hand for a minute?" he asked suddenly, fixing his eyes on her. She stared at him, dazed and transfixed. He went over and knelt beside her and buried his face in her lap, remaining motionless. In all her burning embarrassment, she could not help putting her hand, with tenderness and compassion, on the nape of his neck. He trembled with a deep shudder. She was utterly incapable of resisting his appeal, giving him anything, everything. He was a curious and very gentle lover. To her it meant nothing except that she gave herself to him. At length he ceased to quiver any more and lay quite still. Then with dim, compassionate fingers, she stroked his head that lay on her breast. When he rose, he kissed both her hands, then both her feet, and in silence moved away to the far end of the room. After some minutes he turned and came back to her. "Now I suppose you'll hate me," he said quietly. "Why should I?" she asked. "A woman is supposed to." He paused. "Sir Clifford, won't he be—" "Perhaps," she said, looking up at him. "I don't want Clifford to know, not even to suspect. It would hurt him so much." He'll know nothing from me, he said almost fiercely. May I do anything for you? How can I be sure that you don't hate me, that you won't hate me? No, I don't hate you, she replied. I think you're nice. Ah, he responded. I'm glad you said that to me rather than said you love me. It means so much more. Until this afternoon, then. With that he kissed her and was gone. That evening, Connie felt Michaelis must have forgotten their morning together. But he had not forgotten. He simply knew what he was, an outsider. He accepted this fact, and this isolation was a necessity to him, just as his appearance of conformity and of mixing with smart people were necessities. But occasional love-making, as a comfort, was also a good thing, and he was not ungrateful. He made love to her again on each of the 3 days he stayed. To Clifford he was exactly the same as on the first evening, and to Connie also. There was no breaking down the external man. Connie never really understood him, but in her way she loved him. So they went on for a while, writing and meeting occasionally in London, for she still wanted the physical and sexual thrill she could get from him, and he still wanted to give it to her. Then she was tremendously cheerful at Rugby. Yet when those days of joy and stimulus were gone, quite gone, she was once again depressed and irritable. Then how Clifford longed for them again. Had he known the cause, he might even have wished to get her and Michaelis together once more. At this time, Clifford was making great strides into fame and even money. People came to see him, though there were few men who visited regularly. But Connie found these friends of Clifford had such cold minds. She had more respect for Michaelis, on whom they poured scorn. In truth, Mitch, as she called him, was antisocial, which was what Clifford and his cronies had against him. They were more or less bent on saving mankind, or on instructing it to do as they said. On a frosty February morning, Clifford and Connie went for a walk across the park to the wood. That is, Clifford in his motor chair and Connie walking beside him. At the wood's edge, rabbits bobbed and nibbled. Rooks suddenly rose in a black train and went trailing off over the sky. In the wood itself, everything was motionless. Clifford loved the wood. He loved the old oak trees. He wanted to protect them. As he sat there, looking at the curve of the rise, he said, I consider this is really the heart of England. This is old England, and I intend to keep it intact. Oh yes, said Connie. I want this wood perfect, untouched, Clifford went on. I want nobody to trespass in it. I'm more upset at not having a son when I come here than at any other time. But the wood is older than your family, noted Connie gently. Quite, agreed Clifford. But we've preserved it. If it wasn't for us, it would all go, like the rest of the forest. If it isn't preserved, there'll be no England left. That's why having a son helps. I'm only a link in a chain. I'm sorry we can't have a son, she said. He looked at her steadily. It would almost be a good thing if you had a child by another man, he remarked. If we brought it up at Rugby, it would belong to us and to the place. Don't you think it's worth considering? Connie looked up. The child, her child, their child, was just an it to him. It. Clifford continued. Does it matter so very much? After all, you had that lover in Germany. What is he to you now? Almost nothing. What matters is what lasts through one's life. My own life matters to me, its long continuance and development. So what do these occasional sexual connections matter? You and I are married no matter what happens to us. You and I are interwoven at marriage. If we stick to that, we ought to be able to arrange this sex thing, as if we were going to the dentist, since fate has given us a physical checkmate. Connie listened in a sort of wonder, mingled with a kind of fear. She did not know whether he was wrong or right. And wouldn't you mind what man's child I had? She asked. Why, Connie, I should trust your natural instinct of decency and selection. You just wouldn't let the wrong sort of fellow touch you. She thought of Michaelis. He was absolutely Clifford's idea of the wrong sort of fellow. "I think you're right, Clifford," she said eventually. "As far as I can see, I agree with you. Only life may put a new face on it all." "But until life puts a new face on it, you agree?" "Oh, yes, I think I do, really." She was watching a brown spaniel that had run out of a side path. A man with a gun strode swiftly, softly after the dog. It was the new gamekeeper. But he had frightened Connie. He seemed to emerge with such swift menace. He was quickly going downhill. He was dressed in the old style. He had a red face and moustache and distant eyes. "Mellors!" called Clifford. The man turned and saluted. "Will you turn my chair round and get it started? Makes things easier," explained Clifford. The man came up. "Connie, this is the new gamekeeper, Mellors. You haven't spoken to her ladyship yet, have you, Mellors?" "No, sir," came the ready, neutral words. Connie nodded her head shyly. "But you've been here some time, haven't you?" she asked. 8 months, madam, your ladyship." "Do you like it?" "Why, yes, thank you, your ladyship. I was reared here." They went on down the slope. As they reached the steepish rise of the knoll in the path, Connie looked up. The day had greyed over. There was a raw coldness in the air. It was going to snow. All grey. All grey. The world looked worn out. Once they reached the house, Mellors was dismissed. At lunch, Connie asked her husband, "Who is the gamekeeper?" "Mellors, you saw him," answered Clifford. "Yes, but where did he come from?" "Nowhere. He was a Teversham boy, son of a collier, I believe. He was a keeper here before the war. I was very glad to get him back. He was married, but his wife went off with various men, but finally with a collier at Stacksgate." "So this man's alone?" "More or less. He has a mother in the village, and a child, I believe." He stared at Connie in his peculiar way, giving her this precise information. It made him seem impersonal. She realized its source. Mentally he was alert, but the paralysis, the lasting bruise of the aftershock, was gradually spreading to his effective self. It infected Connie with the fear of nothingness in her life. Michaelis came in the summer. His restlessness was evident. "Look here," he suddenly asked Connie, when they were at last alone in her sitting room. "Why don't you and I make a clean thing of it? Why don't we marry?" "But I am married," she replied, amazed. "Oh, that. He'll divorce you all right. Why don't you and I marry? I want to marry." "But I'm married already," she said. "I can't leave Clifford, you know." "Why not?" he cried. "He'll hardly know you've gone after 6 months. Why, the man's no use for you at all. He's entirely wrapped up in himself." Although Connie felt there was some truth in this, she also felt that Mitch was hardly making a display of selflessness. "I should have to think about it," she said. "I couldn't say now. It may seem to you Clifford doesn't count, but he does. When you think how disabled he is." "Damn it all. If a fellow's got nothing but his disabilities to recommend him." He turned aside. Later that evening he asked her, "You're coming to my room tonight, aren't you?" "All right," she answered. He was a more excited lover that night. He roused a certain craving passion in her, with his little boy nakedness and softness. Afterwards he said, "All darned women are like that. Either they don't go off at all, as if they were dead in there, or else they wait till a chap's really done, and then they start in to bring themselves off, and a chap's got to hang on. I never yet had a woman who went off just at the same moment as I did." Connie was stunned by his incomprehensible brutality. It moved something in her. That night she almost loved him and wanted to marry him. Her whole sexual feeling for him, or for any man, collapsed that night. Her life fell apart from his completely, as if he'd never existed. She went through the days drearily, living a mean sort of life. On one of her bad days, she went out alone to walk in the wood. The report of a gun not far off startled and angered her. Then she heard voices and recoiled. People. She didn't want people. But her ear caught another sound. It was a child sobbing. Someone was ill-treating a child. Turning the corner, she saw the keeper and a little girl who was crying. "Ah, shut up, false little bitch," came the man's angry voice, and the child sobbed louder. Connie's eyes blazed. The man caught sight of her and saluted, but he was pale with anger. "What's the matter? Why is she crying?" demanded Connie. The man gave a little bow. "I cannot tell you, your ladyship," he replied. Connie turned to the child, a ruddy black-haired thing of 9 or 10. "What is it, dear? There, don't cry. See what I've got for you." She held out a sixpence. There were more sobs, but now subduing. There, tell me what's the matter," asked Connie, as the child's hand closed over the coin. It's the pussy," cried the girl. "There." Connie looked to where there was a big black cat stretched out grimly. "A poacher, your ladyship," said the man. She glanced at him angrily. "No wonder the child cried if you shot it when she was there." She turned back to the child. "What's your name?" she asked. "Connie Mellors," responded the piping voice. "Connie Mellors? That's a nice name. And did you come out with your daddy and he shot the pussy? But it was a bad pussy." The little girl looked at her. "I wanted to stop with my gran," she said, pointing down the drive. "At cottage." "At the cottage? And would you like to go back to her?" "Yes." "Then shall I take you?" She turned to the man. "This is your little girl, isn't it?" He saluted. "I suppose I can take her to the cottage?" asked Connie. "If your ladyship wishes." "Good morning," said Connie to him, as she walked on with the child. Before long the girl was left with her gran, and Lady Chatterley went slowly home to Ragby Hall to join forces again with Clifford, to complete one of his stories. She'd made up her mind that she wanted only a child, a baby. That was still one sensation left for her. She would venture very gingerly on that experiment. There was still the man to consider, and curiously there wasn't a man in the world whose children she wanted. She had an idea that he would have to be a foreigner, not an Englishman, still less an Irishman, a real foreigner. Next winter she would get Clifford to London. The following winter she would move him abroad to the south of France or Italy. Connie went out alone every day now, mostly to the wood. Nobody saw her there. One day Clifford wanted to send a message to the keeper, and as the boy was laid up with flu, Connie said she would make the call instead. As she came out of the wood, she saw the keeper's brown stone cottage. At first it looked uninhabited, it was so silent and alone. But a thread of smoke rose from the chimney, and the little garden was dug and kept very tidily. The door was shut. She knocked. There was no answer, so she went round the back and stopped. In the little yard, the man, half naked, was washing himself, utterly unaware of her presence. Connie backed away round the corner of the house and hurried away to the wood. In spite of herself, she'd had a shock. But in her confusion, she was determined to deliver the message to the fellow. She would not be balked. So she sauntered slowly back, listening. The cottage looked just the same. A dog barked, and she knocked again. She heard the man coming lightly downstairs. He opened the door quickly and startled her. "Lady Chatterley," he said. "Will you come in?" She stepped into the rather dreary little room. "I only called with a message from Sir Clifford," she said softly. His eyes looked warm and kind, wonderfully alive and at ease. "Do you live here alone?" she asked. "Quite alone, your ladyship." "But your mother?" she asked. "She lives in her own cottage in the village with the child. She comes and cleans for me on Saturdays. I do the rest myself." Connie wondered at him. She wanted to say so many things, and yet she said nothing. Her only remark was, "I hope I didn't disturb you." "Only combing the air. Nobody knocks here, and the unexpected always sounds ominous." He went out to the garden path with her after she'd given her message. She wandered back into the wood, not knowing that this man of 37 was looking after her, and went indoors thinking, "She's nice, she's real. She's nicer than she knows." Afterwards, Connie wondered much about him. He seemed so unlike a gamekeeper. He was something out of the ordinary. That evening when she went to bed, she sobbed bitterly. And in her bitterness burned a cold indignation against Clifford and his writings, and his talk, against all the men of his sort who defrauded a woman even of her own body. Unjust, unjust. Her sense of deep physical injustice burned her to her very soul. But in the morning, she was up at 7 as usual, and going downstairs to Clifford. She had to help him in all the intimate things, for he had no man, and had refused a woman servant. It was a demand on Connie, but she'd wanted to do what she could, so she hardly ever left Ragby Hall, and never for more than a day or two, when Mrs. Betts, the housekeeper, attended to Clifford, who took the service for granted. A sense of rebellion smouldered in Connie that morning. What was the good of it all? What was the good of her sacrificing, her devoting her life to Clifford? What was she serving, after all? A cold spirit of vanity, craving for success. When all the visitors came and went, it was no better. She continued plodding on, but a sense of exasperation and irritation had seized her, which she couldn't escape. The days seemed to grind by, nothing happened. She was getting thinner. Even the housekeeper noticed it, and asked her about herself. Connie needed help and knew it, so she wrote a little cri de coeur to her sister Hilda. "I've not been well lately, and I don't know what's the matter with me." So down came Hilda from Scotland that March. "Connie," she cried on arrival, "whatever's the matter with you?" "Nothing," said Connie rather shamefacedly. "But you're ill, child," said Hilda, looking at her. "No, not ill. Perhaps I'm just bored," replied Connie. The light of battle glowed in Hilda's face. "This wretched place," she murmured, looking at lumbering Ragby Hall with real distaste. Soft and warm as a ripe pear herself, Hilda was an Amazon of the old breed. She went on quietly to Clifford. He thought how handsome she looked, but also he shrank from her. He considered his wife's family as outsiders, while he sat well-groomed, his well-bred expression inscrutable. Hilda thought he looked sulky and stupid. "Connie's looking awfully unwell," she declared in her soft voice. "She's a little thinner," he replied. "Haven't you done anything about it?" "Do you think it necessary?" he asked. Hilda glowered at him. "I'll take her to a doctor," she said, "in London, one whom I trust." Though boiling with rage at her impertinence, Clifford said nothing. Over coffee after dinner, Hilda once again addressed Clifford. "You must have a nurse or somebody to look after you personally. It's necessary. Either that or Father and I must take Connie away for some months. This can't go on." "What can't go on?" Clifford asked. "Haven't you even looked at the child?" asked Hilda. "Connie and I will discuss it," he replied. "I've already discussed it with her," stated Hilda. Clifford had been long enough in the hands of nurses. He hated them, because they left him no real privacy, and he couldn't stand a man hanging around him. Much better any woman, so why not Connie? On examination in London, the doctor recommended Connie had to be amused. "You're spending your life without renewing it," he continued. "You can't go on, you know. Depression. Avoid depression." On their return to Ragby, Hilda spoke to Clifford. "Here is the address of a good manservant. I can assure you he really is a good man and sure to come. But I'm not an invalid, and I'll not have a manservant," objected Clifford. "Very well, then. If we don't settle something by tomorrow, I shall telegraph Father, and together we shall take Connie away." "Will Connie go?" asked Clifford. "She doesn't want to, but she knows she must. We're not running any more risks." So next day, Clifford suggested Mrs. Bolton, the Teversham parish nurse, as his helper. The two sisters called on Mrs. Bolton at once. She would come to Ragby immediately, if Dr. Shardler would let her off. So on the following Sunday, Mrs. Bolton duly arrived at Ragby Hall with her 2 trunks. Hilda talked things over with her, and Mrs. Bolton was ready at any moment to chat. Although she seemed so young, from the way passion would flush in her rather pale cheeks, she was in fact 47. Her husband, Ted Bolton, had been killed in the pit 22 years before, leaving her alone with 2 children to bring up. The upper classes fascinated her, appealing to her peculiar English passion for superiority. She was thrilled to come to Ragby, thrilled to talk to Lady Chatterley. Yet one could also notice a grudge against the Chatterleys in her, a grudge against the masters. For the first week or so, Mrs. Bolton was very quiet at Ragby. Her assured, bossy manner left her. She seemed nervous. With Clifford she was shy, almost frightened and silent. He liked that, and soon recovered his self-possession, letting her do things for him without even noticing her. "She's a useful non-entity," he declared. Connie opened her eyes in wonder, but she did not contradict him. In time he bullied the nurse, but she didn't mind. She neither resented nor disliked Clifford. Now quietly, subtly, Connie was unravelling the tangle of Clifford's consciousness and hers, breaking the threads gently, one by one. With both patience and impatience she struggled to get clear. But the bonds of love are more difficult to loose than most bonds, though Mrs. Bolton's arrival had been a great help. Clifford still wanted the old intimate evenings of talk with Connie, talk or reading aloud. But now, at 10, Connie would go upstairs and be alone, believing Clifford was in good hands with Mrs. Bolton. Connie felt herself released into another world. She felt she breathed differently. But she was still afraid of how many of her roots were tangled with Clifford's. Yet still she seemed free. A new phase was beginning in her life. Mrs. Bolton also kept a caring eye on Connie, feeling she must extend to her female and professional protection. She was always urging her ladyship to be in the open air, for Connie had got into the habit of sitting still by the fire, pretending to read or sew, and hardly going out at all. One blustery day, soon after Hilda had gone, Mrs. Bolton suggested to Connie, "Now, why don't you go for a walk through the wood, and look at the daffodils behind the keeper's cottage? They're the prettiest sight. You could bring some back to put in your room." Connie took all this in good part. Little gusts of sunshine blew, strangely bright, lit up the celandines at the wood's edge. They spangled bright and yellow. Connie was strangely excited in the wood, and the colour flew back to her cheeks and burned blue in her eyes. She drifted on until she came to the clearing and saw the green moss-stained stone cottage, now looking almost rosy. The stone warmed in a burst of sunlight. The door was closed. No sound was to be heard, no smoke from the chimney, no dog barking. She went quietly round the back. She had an excuse, to see the daffodils. And there they were, rustling, fluttering and shimmering, so bright and alive, with nowhere to hide their faces from the wind. Constance sat down and watched the daffodils turn golden in a sudden bright ray of sun that warmed her hands and her lap. The sunshine quickly gave way to chill. The daffodils were once more in shadow. She rose, took a few daffodils and went back to the hall. She had hated breaking the flowers. The next afternoon she went to the wood again, this time to follow a spring called Blynn's Well. How icy and clear it was, how brilliant. She listened to the faint tinkle of water as the tiny overflow trickled downhill. The place was a little sinister, cold and damp. As Connie rose to go home, she heard a faint tapping away to her right, and she stood still to listen. It was hammering. She walked on, turning down a new track between fir trees, which she followed while all the time the sound of the hammering grew nearer. She saw a secret little clearing, and a secret little hut made of poles. She realized it was the quiet place where growing pheasants were reared. The keeper was in his shirt-sleeves, kneeling, hammering. The dog trotted forward to meet her with a short, sharp bark, and the keeper lifted his face suddenly and saw her, with a startled look in his eyes. He resented the intrusion. "I wondered what the hammering was," she explained, feeling a little afraid of him. "I'm getting the coops ready for young birds," he replied. "I should like to sit down for a while," she said. He went into the hut and drew out a chair. He looked at her hands. They were rather blue, so he took some larch twigs and lit a fire. "Sit here a bit and warm you," he ordered. She obeyed him. She did not really want to sit, cramped up in a corner by the fire. She would rather have watched from the door. But she was being looked after, so she had to submit. She listened to the tapping of the man's hammer. It was not so happy. She sensed he felt oppressed, that she was a trespasser on his privacy and a dangerous one. A woman. He did not want to come into contact with a woman again. He feared it. for he had a big, unhealed wound from old contacts. He felt if he could not be alone, if he could not be left alone, he would die. His last refuge was this wood. Connie grew warm by the fire. Then she grew hot. She went and sat on the stool in the doorway, watching the man at work. He seemed to take no notice of her, but he knew all right. He finished off the coop, while Connie watched him fixedly. She felt his experience had been deeper and wider than her own, much deeper and wider, and perhaps more deadly. Mellors wished above all else that she would go away and leave him to his privacy. He dreaded her cool, upper-class impudence, her having her own way. For after all, he was only a hired hand. He disliked her presence there. Connie came to herself suddenly. She rose. The afternoon was turning to evening, yet she could not go away. She went over to the man. "It's so nice here, so restful," she said. "I think I shall come and sit here sometimes." "Yes?" "Do you lock up the hut when you're not here?" "Yes, your ladyship." "Do you think I could have a key too, so that I could sit here sometimes?" "Happen Sir Clifford'd know," he said, trying to put her off. "Very well, I'll see to it." "All right, your ladyship." Their eyes met. His showed a cold, ugly look of dislike and contempt for her, mixed with indifference to what would happen. Hers were hot with rejection. Her heart sank as she understood how utterly he disliked her when she went against him. "Good afternoon," she said finally. "Afternoon, my lady." He saluted and turned away. She walked sullenly home. Back at Ragby, as she poured Clifford his tea, she asked him, "Do you think there's a second key to that little hut not far from John's well, where the pheasants are reared?" "There may be. Why?" "I happened to find it today. It's a lovely place. I could sit there sometimes, couldn't I?" "Was Mellors there?" "Yes, that's how I found it, from his hammering. He didn't seem to like my intruding at all. In fact, he was almost rude when I asked him about a second key. He said he knew nothing about keys." "There may be one in Father's study. Betts knows them all. I'll get him to look." "Oh, do," she said. "I don't see why Mellors should mind. It's not his home after all. I don't see why I shouldn't sit there if I want to." "Quite," said Clifford. "He thinks too much of himself, that man. But he does his duty all right as far as I'm concerned." The weather became rainy again, but after a day or two, Connie went out in the rain to the wood. Once again she made towards the hut. She came to the clearing. There was no one there. The hut was locked, but she sat on the doorstep and snuggled into her own warmth. The rain was abating. It was hardly dark among the oaks any more. Connie wanted to go, yet she sat on. She was getting colder, yet the overwhelming inertia of her inner resentment kept her there as if paralyzed. Suddenly a wet brown dog came running up to her, but this time did not bark, lifting instead a wet feather of a tail. Mellors followed in a wet black oilskin jacket. She felt him recoil when he saw her. He saluted her without speaking, coming slowly nearer. She began to withdraw. "I'm just going," she said. "Was you waiting to get in?" he asked. "No. I only sat here a few minutes in the shelter," she replied with a quiet dignity. He glared at her. She looked cold. "Sir Clifford hadn't got another key, then?" he asked. "No, but it doesn't matter. Good afternoon." He watched her closely as she moved away. Then he took out the key of the hut. "Happen you'd better have this key. I can find another place that'll do for the rearing of the pheasants. If you want to be here, you'll not want me messing about all the time." She replied coldly, "Why don't you speak ordinary English?" "Me? I thought it not ordinary." She was angry. "I don't want your key. I don't want you to clear out anything at all. I don't want to turn you out of your hut, thank you. I only want to sit here sometimes, like today, so please say no more about it." He looked at her curiously. She went on, calmer now. "I won't disturb you, don't be worried. You are Sir Clifford's keeper, not mine." "No, your ladyship. It's your ladyship's own hut. It's as your ladyship likes and pleases every time. You can turn me off at a week's notice." "Do you think I ought to be afraid of you?" she asked, angered once more. Why should I take any notice of you and your being here or not? Why is it so important?" He looked at her, his face glimmering with wicked laughter. "It's not, your ladyship, not in the least," he said. "Shall I get your ladyship another key, then?" "No, thank you, I don't want it." "I'll get it anyhow. We'd best to have 2 keys for the place." "And I consider you insolent," said Connie. "Nay, nay," he said quickly, "I never meant nothing." Connie went away bewildered. She was not sure whether she'd been insulted or not. Perhaps the man really only meant what he said, that he thought she would expect him to keep away. As if she would dream of it. She went home in confusion, not knowing what she thought or felt. Connie felt weak and utterly forlorn. She wished some help would come from outside. But at least Clifford was shifting his grip from her to Mrs. Bolton. Mrs. Bolton was admirable in many ways, but she also had a queer sort of bossiness, which was at odds with her view that she was utterly subservient to others. Clifford fascinated her because he always, or so often, frustrated her will, as if by a finer instinct. He had finer, subtler means of self-assertion than herself, which charmed her. Perhaps that had been his charm too for Connie. Mrs. Bolton now did almost everything for him, and he felt more and more at home with her, less ashamed of accepting her menial offices than he had with Connie. Mrs. Bolton loved having his body completely in her charge. As she said to Connie one day, "All men are babies, when you come to the bottom of them. Why, I've handled some of the toughest customers as ever went down Tevershall Pit. But let anything ail them, so that you have to do for them, and they're like babies, just big babies. Oh, there's not much difference in men." At first Mrs. Bolton thought there really was something different in a real gentleman like Sir Clifford. But gradually, as she came to know him well, she found he was like the rest, a baby grown to man's proportions. But a baby with a strange temper, with a manner and power in his control, and all sorts of odd knowledge that she had never dreamed of, with which he could still bully her. Connie was sometimes tempted to say to him, "For God's sake, don't fall so horribly into the hands of that woman." But she found in the long run that she didn't care for him enough to say it. They still spent the evening together until 10 o'clock, when they would talk or read together or go over his manuscript. But the thrill had gone out of it. Connie was bored by his writing. Now she would sometimes plead a headache as an excuse for going up to her room after dinner. To Connie, Clifford seemed to be coming out in his true colours, a little vulgar, a little common, and rather uninspired. Ivy Bolton's tricks and humble bossiness were also only too transparent. The very fact that there could be no love affair left Mrs. Bolton free to be thrilled to her very marrow by her passion for contact with a man of the upper class. In this, there was a lurking private satisfaction about her. How Connie loathed it. No wonder Clifford had been caught by the woman. She absolutely adored him, and put herself absolutely at his service, for him to use as he liked. No wonder he was flattered. Connie listened to their conversations. She concluded there was only one class nowadays, money people, the money boy and the money girl. The only difference was how much you'd got, and how much you wanted. Under Mrs. Bolton's influence, Clifford began to take a new interest in the mines. He began to feel he belonged. It brought a new sense of power, something he had till now shrunk from with dread. Tevershall pits were running thin. Now there were only 2 collieries left, Tevershall itself and New London. Tevershall had once been a famous mine and had made fabulous money, but its best days were over. New London was never very rich, but now times were bad, and it was pits like New London that got left. It was Mrs. Bolton's talk that really put a bright new ring into Clifford. His income from his father's trust, as she pointed out to him, was secure, even though it was not large. The pits did not really concern him, for it was the other world he wanted to capture, the popular world, not the working world. Now he understood the distinction between popular success and working success. Beneath the populace of pleasure lay the populace of work, grim, grimy, and terrible. But they too had their providers, and it was a much grimmer business providing for the populace of work than for the populace of pleasure. While he was working on his stories and getting on in the world, Tevershall was going to the wall. But under Mrs. Bolton's influence, Clifford was tempted to enter this other fight, to capture success by brute means, by industrial production. In one way, Mrs. Bolton made a man of him, as Connie never had. Connie kept him apart, which made him sensitive and conscious of himself, and his own state of mind. Now Clifford even roused himself to go to the mine again, and he began to reread technical works, government reports and books on the chemistry of shale and coal. He became interested in pulling Tevershall out of the hole. He felt a new sense of power flowing through him, power over hundreds and hundreds of colliers. New life came to him, rushing into him out of the coal, out of the pit. He was doing something. He was going to do something. He was going to win, to win. He felt triumphant. He had at last come out of himself. He was not aware how much Mrs. Bolton was behind him. He did not know how much he depended on her. He felt he owed Connie everything, and he showed her the utmost respect and consideration. So long as she gave him outward respect, although it was obvious he had a secret dread of her, only when he was alone with Mrs. Bolton did he really feel like lord and master. Connie was a good deal more alone now. Fewer people came to Ragby, for Clifford no longer wanted them. Now that Clifford was drifting off to his new obsession with industrial activity, Connie felt herself completely stranded. She was not even free, for Clifford must always have her there. He seemed to have a nervous apprehension that she would leave him. She must be there at Ragby Hall, as Lady Chatterley, his wife. Otherwise he would be lost like an imbecile on a moor. The extent of this amazing dependence dawned on Connie with a sort of horror. Clifford had become a practical man, an amazingly astute and powerful one, a true master, which Connie attributed to Mrs. Bolton's influence upon him at the crisis in his life. But this astute practical man was almost an idiot when left alone to his own emotional life. He worshipped Connie. "Clifford," she asked him one day, after she had obtained the key to the hut, "would you really like me to have a child one day?" "I shouldn't mind, if it made no difference between us," he said. "No difference to what?" she asked. "To you and me, to our love for one another. If it's going to affect that, then I'm all against it. Why, I might even one day have a child of my own. I mean, it might come back to me one of these days." She stared at him in amazement. He went on quickly, "I tell you, I'm quite willing, provided it doesn't alter your love for me. If it altered that, I'm absolutely against it." Connie could only be silent, cold fear mingled with contempt. "Oh, it wouldn't make any difference to my feeling for you," she said, with a certain sarcasm. "In that case, I don't mind in the least. I mean, it would be awfully nice to have a child running about the house and feel one was building up a future for it. I should have something to strive for then." At times like this, Connie really felt she could die. While Clifford's strange business efficiency overawed her in a way, his declaration of private worship put her into panic. There was now nothing between them. He no longer even took her hand and held it kindly. It was the cruelty of utter impotence. She felt either her reason would give way, or she would die. One afternoon, as she sat brooding in the wood, the keeper strode up to her. "I got you a key made, my lady," he said, saluting, and he offered her the key. "Thank you," she said, startled by his abrupt approach. "The hut's not very tidy," he continued. "I cleared what I could. I'm setting the ends in about a week, but they won't be scared of you." A tear fell from Connie's eyes onto her wrist. He stood up and moved away, for suddenly he was aware of the old flame shooting and leaping up in his loins. He fought against it. Without knowing, he returned to her and put a chick back in the coop because she was afraid of the hen. Connie was now crying blindly. His heart melted suddenly, like a drop of fire, and he laid his fingers on her knee. "You shouldn't cry," he said softly. He laid his hand on her shoulders, and gently it began to travel down the curve of her back, to stroke the curve of her flank. She dried her face. "Shall you come to the hut?" he asked in a quiet, neutral voice. He drew her up and led her slowly to the hut. There he spread out a blanket. His face was pale. "You lie there," he said softly. With a strange obedience, she lay down quite still, as if in a sort of dream, as his hand groped softly in the dark among her clothing. Yet the hand was knowing. Then, with a quiver of exquisite pleasure, he touched her warm, soft body. It was a moment of pure peace for him, the moment of entry into the body of a woman. She lay still, could strive no more. She did not begin to rouse till he had finished and lay softly panting against her breast. Then she wondered, just dimly wondered, why? Why was this necessary? Why had it given her peace? Was it real? The man lay in mysterious stillness. What was he feeling? What was he thinking? She did not know. He was a stranger to her. She did not know him. She must wait. His very stillness was peaceful. She knew that when at last he arose and drew away from her, it was like an abandonment. He stood a few moments apparently adjusting his own clothing. Then he quietly opened the door and went out. She saw a very brilliant little moon shining over the oaks. Quickly she got up and arranged herself until she was tidy once more. Then she went to the door of the hut. The sky overhead was crystal clear. He came towards her. "Shall we go, then?" he asked. "Where?" "I'll go with you to the gate." He locked the door of the hut and came after her. "You aren't sorry, are you?" "No, no. Are you?" "For that, no," he replied. "But there's Sir Clifford, other folks, all the complications." "And are you not a little sorry?" she repeated. "In a way. There's no keeping clear. I thought I'd done with all that." "It's just love," she said cheerfully. "Whatever that might be," he replied. They went on through the wood. "You don't hate me, do you?" she asked. "Nay, nay," he paused. "If only there weren't so many other people in the world." She laughed. He left her at the gate. "Shall I come again?" "Yes, yes." Connie left him and returned across the park. Almost with bitterness he watched her go. She had cost him the privacy of a man who only wants to be left alone. He turned back into the dark of the wood. The world allows no hermits, and now he had taken on that woman, brought on himself a new cycle of pain and doom. He knew by experience what it meant. Mellors went home with his gun and his dog to his dark cottage, where he lit the lamp, started the fire, and ate his supper. To tell the truth, as he sat by the fireside afterwards, he was sorry for what had happened, perhaps mostly for her sake. He had a sense of foreboding about it, but was not afraid for himself. But he was quite consciously afraid of society, which he knew by instinct to be a malevolent, partly insane beast. If only there were other men he could be with, fight with. Constance, for her part, had hurried home across the park, almost without thinking. As yet she had had no afterthoughts. She would still be in time for dinner. Mr. Linley, the general manager of the collieries, stayed to share the meal, and Connie was the hostess. Attentive and aware, with big wide blue eyes and a soft repose that sufficiently hid what she was really thinking, Connie had played this role so often that it had almost become second nature to her. She waited patiently until she could go upstairs and think her own thoughts. Once in her room, however, she didn't really know what to think. What sort of man was Mellors, really? Did he really like her? Not much, she felt, and yet he was kind. But she felt he might be kind like that to any woman. Even so, it was curiously soothing, comforting. Really, it wasn't personal. She was only another female to him. Perhaps that was better. She went to the wood next day. It was a grey, still afternoon. She came to the clearing, but Mellors was not there. Connie sat and watched the pheasant chicks and waited. She waited. The time passed with dreamlike slowness, and still he did not come. He never came all the afternoon. Connie felt she must go home to tea. As she went home, a fine drizzle of rain fell. After tea, she slipped out of the house in her old mackintosh. The drizzle of rain was like a veil over the world, mysterious and hushed, but not cold. She got very warm as she hurried across the park. The wood was silent and still. The trees glistened. There was still no one at the clearing. He'd not been there. Perhaps something was wrong. Perhaps she should go to the cottage and see. But Connie was born to wait, so she opened the hut with her key and sat down on the stool in the doorway. How quiet everything was. Night was drawing near again, and she would have to leave. But suddenly he came striding into the clearing. He crouched in silence in front of the coops, carefully shutting the hens and chicks up safe against the night. At last he came slowly towards her and stood before her under the porch. "You come then," he said. "Yes," she said, looking up. "You're late. Do you want to come in?" "Won't folks be thinking summat? You come in here every night?" he asked. "Why should they know? Folks always does. Think what if folks find out, Sir Clifford and everyone talking?" "Well, I can go away." "Where to?" he asked. "Anywhere. I've got money of my own. Anyway, what do I care about my ladyship? I hate it, really." "Don't you care about the risk?" he asked huskily. "You should care." "But I've nothing to lose," she explained. "Are you afraid for yourself?" "Aye," he said briefly, "I am. I'm afraid of things, everybody, a lot of 'em." He bent down suddenly and kissed her unhappy face. "Nay, I don't care," he continued. "I brought another blanket, so we can put one over us if we like. Let's have it and damn the rest." "I can't stay long," she said. "All right." He shut the door and lit a tiny light in the hurricane lamp. "Hey, what it is to touch thee," he said, as his finger caressed her delicate warm skin. She did not understand the beauty he found in her. She felt the slide of his cheek on her thighs and belly, and her knees began to quiver. She was half afraid of the sensation. Half of her wished he would not caress her so. He was encompassing her somehow, yet she was waiting. When he came into her, she was still waiting. She felt herself a little left out. She willed herself into this separateness. Now perhaps she was condemned to it. Even when he had finished, she did not rouse herself to get a grip on her own satisfaction, as she'd done with Michaelis. She lay still, and the tears slowly welled and ran from her eyes. He lay still too. "Are you cold?" he asked softly. "No, but I must go," she said, gently. He sighed, holding her closer, then relaxed to rest again. He had not noticed her tears. "I must go," she repeated. "I must come to the cottage one time," he said, as he rose, putting on his coat and hat. "Come then," he said. She rose slowly. She didn't want to go. He helped her with her thin waterproof and saw that she was tidy. Outside it was quite dark. He walked with her. "I must come to the cottage one time," he repeated. "Shall I? We might as well be hung for a sheep as for a lamb." It puzzled her, his persistence in wanting her when there was nothing between them. As they turned the last corner to the gate, he blew out the light he carried. "We'll see from here," he said, taking her gently by the arm. There seemed a ghostly glimmer of greyness in the open space of the park. Suddenly he drew her to him and whipped his hand under her dress again, feeling her warm body with his wet, chill hand. "I could die for the touch of a woman like thee," he said, "if thou would stop another minute." "No, I must run," she responded. "Kiss me." He kissed her on the left eye. "I'll come tomorrow," she promised, drawing away, "if I can." "Aye, but not so late," he replied out of the darkness. "Good night." She plunged into the dark, grey night. She slipped into her room unseen. She must take a bath. "But I won't be late any more," she said to herself. "It's too annoying." The next day, she did not go to the wood. Instead, she went with Clifford to Uthwaite. Nor did she go to the wood the day following. She did not go so long as she felt, or imagined she felt, the man was waiting for her, wanting her. But on the fourth day, she was terribly unsettled and uneasy. At last she decided to take a walk, not towards the wood, but in the opposite direction. She would go to Marchhay. She walked on, unaware of anything outside her, till she was startled by the barking of the dogs at Marchhay Farm. She saw Mrs. Flint there, who used to be her schoolteacher. Mrs. Flint showed her down to the pasture. "They're milling tonight," said Mrs. Flint severely. They came to the fence, where there was a little gate, but it was locked. In the grass, on the inside, stood an empty bottle. "That's the keeper's empty bottle for his milk," explained Mrs. Flint. "We bring it as far as here for him, and then he fetches it himself." "When?" asked Connie. "Any time, often in the morning." "Well, goodbye, Lady Chatterley, and do come again. It was so lovely seeing you." Connie climbed the fence and hurried on with her head down, thinking of Mrs. Flint's baby. Suddenly she started out of her muse and gave a little cry of fear. A man was there. It was the keeper. He stood in the path, barring her way. "How's this?" he asked in surprise. "I went to Marchhay." He looked at her curiously, searchingly, and she hung her head a little guiltily. "And you were going to the yacht now?" he asked. "No, I mustn't. No one knows where I am. I'm late, I've got to run." "Giving me the slip like," he said. No, only... Not now, she cried. He held her fast, and she felt his urgency. Her old instinct was to fight for her freedom, but something else in her was strangely inert and heavy. She hadn't the heart to fight any more. He looked around. Come through here," he said, looking into the dense copse of fir trees. She saw his eyes, tense and brilliant, fierce, not loving. But her will had left her. He led her through the prickly trees to a place where there was a little space. He put down his waistcoat, and she had to lie down there under the boughs of the trees. As he began to move, there awoke in her strange new thrills rippling inside her, rippling like the overlapping of soft flames, soft as feathers running to points of exquisite brilliance. She was unconscious of the wild little cries she uttered. It was soon over, too soon. This was different. She clung to him, unconscious in passion. Her grip on him slowly relaxed, and she lay inert. And they lay and knew nothing, not even of each other, both lost. Until at last he began to rise and became aware of his defenseless nakedness, at which he drew away and kissed her. He covered her over and began to cover himself. She remained looking up at the boughs of the trees, unable as yet to move. All was dense and silent. He sat down again once he had dressed and took Connie's hand in silence. She looked into his brooding face. "Are you glad?" she asked. "Glad?" he answered. "Aye, but never mind." He did not want her to talk, would never tell her anything he didn't want to tell her. The last level rays of the sun touched the wood. "I won't come with you," he said. "Better not." His dog was waiting anxiously for him to go, and he seemed to have nothing whatever left to say. Nothing. Connie went slowly home. Another self was alive in her, and with this self she adored him. It was not the passion that was new to her. It was the yearning adoration. She knew she had always feared it, for it left her helpless. She feared it still, lest if she adored him too much, then she would lose herself, become like a slave, a savage woman. She must not become a slave. It was too early yet to begin to fear the man. "I walked over to Marchhay," she explained to Clifford, "and saw Mrs. Flint. Did you wonder where I was?" "Well, I wondered, but I guess you dropped in somewhere," replied Clifford jealously. With a sort of second sight, he sensed something new in her, something quite incomprehensible to him. "Oh, it's so good for you," said Mrs. Bolton, "if you can go out and see a bit of company sometimes. I was just saying to Sir Clifford, it would do her ladyship a world of good if she'd go out among people more." "Yes, I'm glad I went, and Mrs. Flint is such a quaint, dear, cheeky baby, Clifford," said Connie. "Wouldn't you like to see it? In fact, I've asked him to tea so that you can." "Who?" he asked. "Mrs. Flint and the baby, next Monday." "Oh, I'll see it, but I don't want to sit through tea with them. You can have them to tea up in your room." "You can have a nice, cosy tea up in your room, milady," agreed Mrs. Bolton. "Mrs. Flint will be so much more comfortable than if Sir Clifford was there." She was sure Connie had a lover, and something in her soul exulted. But who was he? Perhaps Mrs. Flint would provide a clue. Clifford was very uneasy. He would not let Connie go after dinner, and she had wanted so much to be alone. She looked at him, and was unusually submissive. As she was sewing a little silk frock for Mrs. Flint's baby, Clifford read to her. Inside herself she could feel the humming of passion. Clifford was frightened by her soft stillness sitting there. She'd never been so utterly soft and still. She heard not a syllable of his reading. She was enveloped in her own soft rapture. In herself, in all her veins, she felt Mellors and his child. Clifford's voice went on. What a strange creature he was, with the sharp, cold, inflexible will of some bird, and no warmth at all. She shuddered a little, afraid of him. But then the soft, warm flame of life was stronger than he, and the real things were hidden from him. The reading finished. Startled, she looked up, and was more startled still to see Clifford watching her with pale, uncanny eyes, like hate. "What are you making?" he asked. "I'm making a child's dress for Mrs. Flint's baby." He turned away. A child, that was her obsession. He was tired. This evening had tired him. Connie was glad to go up to bed, but she was going without kissing him good night. He watched her with his sharp, cold eyes. So, she did not even kiss him good night after he'd spent an evening reading to her. Such depths of callousness in her. He gazed coldly and angrily at the door behind which she had gone. Again the dread of night came on Clifford. He was haunted by anxiety and a sense of a dangerous, impending void. He was afraid, and Connie could keep the fear off him if she would, but it was obvious that she wouldn't. She was callous, cold and callous to all that he did for her. He gave up his life to her, and she was callous in return, only wanting her own way. Now it was a baby she was obsessed by, just so that it should be her own, all her own, and not his. He dreaded the nights he could not sleep. Then it was awful indeed, when annihilation pressed in on him on every side. Then it was ghastly, to exist without having any real life, lifeless in the night. However, now he could ring for Mrs. Bolton, and she would always be there. That was a great comfort. That night she was wondering who Lady Chatterley's lover was, and thinking of her own Ted, so long dead, yet for her never quite dead. In her half-sleep, these thoughts combined, and she somehow felt she shared with her ladyship a great grudge against Sir Clifford and all he stood for. Connie was in bed fast asleep all this time, but the keeper too could not rest. He'd closed the coops and made his round of the wood, then gone home and eaten supper. But he did not go to bed. Instead, he sat by the fire and thought. He thought of his boyhood, his wife, and his life abroad in India and Egypt as a soldier. He was standing still with his life. He had thought he would be safe, at least for a time, in this wood, where he would be alone and apart from life, which was all he wanted. But he did not really know what to do with himself. He had not cared nor bothered till now, when this woman had come into his life. He was nearly 10 years older than she, and he was 1,000 years older in experience, starting from the bottom. The connection between them was growing closer. He was no longer young and merely buoyant, neither was he an insensitive sort. Each bitterness and every ugliness would hurt him, and his woman. But even if they got clear of Sir Clifford, what were they going to do? What was he going to do? What was he thinking to do with his life? For he must do something. He wouldn't be a mere hanger-on. The problem seemed insoluble. He could only think of going to America, to try a new place, although he disbelieved in the country utterly. Perhaps there was something else. He could not rest or go to bed. After midnight he got up from his chair and reached for his coat and gun. "Come on, lass," he said to the dog. "We're best outside." He went on a slow, soft, stepping and stealthy round. When he had completed his cautious beating around of his bounds, he was tired. There had been no sound, save for the faint shuffling from Stacksgate Colliery. That never ceased working. The world lay darkly and fumily sleeping, except for a few hazy lightning flashes from the furnaces of greed stirring in its sleep. It was cold and he was coughing. He thought again of the woman. Now he would have given all he had to hold her warm in his arms and sleep. It seemed that sleep with the woman in his arms was the only thing necessary. He went to the hut and lay on the floor wrapped in the blanket to sleep. But still he could not. He got up again and went out to the park. It was nearly 4 o'clock. Still clear and cold, there was no sign of dawn. Slowly, slowly the great house drew him as if it were a magnet. He wanted to be near her. Perhaps he could find her. He could now see the house, with one light burning downstairs, in Sir Clifford's room. He moved a little nearer, standing motionless, waiting, while the dawn faintly and imperceptibly paled behind him. He saw the light in the window go out, but he did not notice Mrs. Bolton come to the window, draw the curtain and stand looking out. She stood blind with sleep, waiting. And as she stood, she started and almost cried out, for there was a man out there on the drive, a black figure in the twilight. She watched, without making a sound, not wanting to disturb Sir Clifford. Daylight began to rustle the world, and the figure became more defined. She made it out as Oliver Mellors, the keeper. What could he want? Goodness. The sudden knowledge passed through Mrs. Bolton like a shot. He was Lady Chatterley's lover. Well, well. So her ladyship had fallen for him. Well, her ladyship wasn't the first. There was something about him, but fancy. That was a sharp slap in the face for the high and mighty Chatterleys. With a sudden snap, the bleeding desire that had drawn Mellors to the woman broke. He had broken it because he must do so. There must be a meeting of the two sides, and if she wasn't meeting him, he wouldn't track her down. He turned slowly, once more accepting his own isolation. He knew it was better that way. Mrs. Bolton saw him disappear. Well, well, she said to herself, he's the one man I never thought of. He was nice to me when he was a lad, after I lost Ted. Whatever would he say if he knew? She glanced triumphantly at the sleeping Clifford. Later, Connie was in one of the Ragby lumber rooms when she remarked to Mrs. Bolton, on touching an old family cradle there, that she might yet have a use for it. I might have a child. Oh dear, Mrs. Bolton was thinking to herself, is it Oliver Mellors' child you're preparing for? Later that day, Mr. Betts drove Mrs. Bolton to her house in the village. She was having a few friends in to admire the escritoire outfit Constance had given her. They thought it marvellous, and then started to whisper about Lady Chatterley's child. Wonders'll never cease, said Mrs. Whedon, the under-cashier's wife, for Mrs. Bolton was convinced, if it did come, it would be Sir Clifford's child. Before long, Clifford himself also began to believe it possible that it might even be his child. He asked his wife, Connie, did you know there was a rumour in the village that you're going to supply Ragby Hall with a son and heir? Connie felt dim with terror, yet she stood quite still, touching the tall yellow tulips she was arranging. No, she said, is it a joke or malicious gossip? Neither, I hope, he answered. I hope it may be a prophecy. Connie went on with her flowers and mentioned she wished to go with her father to Italy. Do you mind? She concluded. For how long will you be away? Perhaps 3 weeks. There was a silence for a time. Well, said Clifford eventually, I suppose I could stand it for 3 weeks, but only if I were absolutely certain you'd want to come back. I should want to come back, she said quietly, with conviction. Somehow Clifford believed her. He felt immensely relieved, joyful at once. I do wish you'd come, she asked him. She would so love to make him happy. Clifford shook his head. Not this year, my dear. Not this year. Next year, I'll probably try. She went away gloomily. It was May, but cold and wet again. The country was dismal. It was chilly, and there was smoke on the rain, a feeling like exhaust vapour in the air. Connie went out to Teversham. When she arrived, there was something uncanny and underground about it all, as though it were an underworld. When she saw the great lorries full of steelworkers from Sheffield, weird, distorted, smelling beings like men off for an excursion to Matlock, her stomach weakened and she thought, oh God, what has man done to man? They've reduced them to less than humans. And now there can be no fellowship any more. It's a nightmare. She again felt a wave of terror, the grey, gritty hopelessness of it all. There was no hope any more. Yet she wanted a baby, an heir to Ragby. She shuddered with dread. Yet Mellors had come out of all this. Yes, but he was as apart from it all as she was. And this was England, the vast bulk of England as Connie knew, since she'd motored from the centre of it. She went on to Stacksgate, new on the face of the earth since the war. Since Connie's arrival at Ragby Hall, this new town had arisen, and the model dwellings had been filled with riffraff who had drifted in from anywhere to poach Clifford's rabbits, among other disreputable occupations. Her car sped by and ran on, along the uplands, where she could see the rolling county spread out. The county. It had once been proud and lordly. In front of her loomed the splendid Elizabethan bulk of Chadwick Hall, more wall than window. Noble it stood alone, above a great park, but now out of date and passed over. It was still kept up, but only as a showplace, a reminder of the past. The present lay below. God alone knew where the future lay. The car descended to Uthwaite, down in the valley, with all the steel threads of the railways to Sheffield drawn through it, and the coal mines and the steelworks sending up their smoke and glare from long tubes. There was the pathetic little corkscrew spire of the church that was going to tumble down, still pricking the fumes, and which always affected Connie strangely. Once you got down into the twisted and crooked heart of the town behind the church, you were in the world of 2 centuries ago. Immediately following the old crooked streets of oldish blackened miners' dwellings were crowded pink rows of larger houses plastering the valley, homes to the modern workman. Behind that again were patch after patch of raw red brick, showed the newest mining settlements. Between were the tattered remnants of the old coaching and cottage England. This was history. One England erases another. The mines had made the halls wealthy, and now they were blotting them out, as they had already blotted out the cottages. Industrial England was removing the agricultural England. Connie herself clung to the remnants of old England. It had taken her years to realize that it was affected out by this terrifying new and gruesome England, and that this effacement would continue until the change was complete. And what would come after? Connie could not imagine. She could only see the new brick streets spreading into the fields. The younger generation were already utterly unconscious of the old England. There was a gap in the continuity of consciousness, which seemed almost American, but in reality was about industry. What next? Connie always felt there was no next. She wanted to hide her head in the sand. The world was so complicated and weird and gruesome. The common people were so many, and really so terrible, she thought as she was going home, and saw the colliers trailing from the pits, grey-black, distorted, scuffing along in their heavy iron-shod boots. Men. In some ways patient and good men, in other ways non-existent. Something that man should have was bred and willed out of them. Yet they remained men. They begot children. One might bear a child to them. Connie was utterly intimidated by the industrial masses. They seemed so weird to her. A life with utterly no beauty in it, no intuition, always in the pit. Yet had not Mellors come from such a father? Not quite, for 40 years had made a difference. An appalling difference in the pitman. The iron and coal had eaten deep into the bodies and souls of these men. What would become of them all? Perhaps with the passing of coal, they would disappear again, disappear off the face of the earth. Perhaps they were only a weird and temporary fauna from the coal seams. Connie was glad to be home, to once again close her eyes to the new world. She was even glad to babble to Clifford, for her fear of the mining and iron Midlands affected her with a queer feeling that went all over her like influenza. The next day, coming downstairs in the morning, she found the keeper's dog, Flossie, sitting in the corridor, outside Clifford's room. "Why, Flossie," she said softly, "what are you doing here?" And she quietly opened Clifford's door. Clifford was sitting up in bed, and the keeper was standing to attention at its foot. "Oh, good morning, Clifford," Connie said. "I didn't know you were busy." Then she looked at the keeper, saying good morning to him. He murmured his reply, looking at her vaguely. But she felt a whiff of passion touch her from his presence alone. "Did I interrupt you, Clifford? I'm sorry." "No, it's nothing of any importance," he replied. She soon slipped out of the room, back up to her bedroom. She sat at the window and saw Mellors go down the drive. He had a natural sort of quiet distinction, an aloof pride, and yet also a look of frailty. A hireling, that's what he was. What did he really think of her? It was a sunny day, and Connie was working in the garden with Mrs. Bolton helping her. It was work they both enjoyed. Connie spoke about Mr. Bolton, and Mrs. Bolton was happy to talk of him. I believe, unbeknown to himself, he hated the pit, just hated it. He looked so quiet when he was dead, as if he got free. He was such a nice-looking lad. It just broke my heart to see him, still and pure-looking, as if he wanted to lie. Oh, it broke my heart, it did. But it was the pit. She wept a few bitter tears, and Connie wept with her. "It must have been terrible for you," she remarked. "Oh, my lady, I never realised it at first. I kept expecting him back, especially at nights. It was as if my feelings wouldn't believe he'd gone. I just felt he's got to come back and lie against me, so I could feel him with me. That was all I wanted. And it took 1,000 shocks before I knew he wouldn't come back. It took me years." "It's terrible once you've got a man into your blood," said Connie. "Oh, my lady, and that's what makes you feel so bitter. You feel other folks wanted him killed. You feel the pit wanted to kill him. There's a lot of hard-hearted folks in the world, and every morning when he got up and went to the pit, I felt it was wrong, wrong. But what else can a man do?" Hate flared in the woman's face. "But can love last so long?" Connie asked suddenly. "Oh, my lady, what else is there to last? Children grow away from you. We might have drifted apart, who knows? But the feeling's something different. When I look at women who've never been warmed through by a man, well, they seem to me poor dull owls, no matter how they may dress up and gad about." Connie went to the wood directly after lunch. It was a lovely day. Everywhere the buds and the leap of life made itself felt in the warm yellow of summer. The keeper was not at the hut. Connie walked on towards the cottage, because she wanted to find him. The cottage stood in the sun at the wood's edge. There was the bark of a dog, and Flossie came running up to her. The door was wide open, so he was at home. And the sunlight falling on the red brick floor. She saw him eating at the table. "May I come in?" she asked. "Come in. Shall you have something? Shall you have a cup of tea?" "Only if you let me make it myself," she responded. He seemed sad, and she felt she was bothering him. "It's lovely here," she remarked. "Such a beautiful stillness. Everything alive, yet still." He was eating again, while she made a cup of tea in silence. She poured it out, but paused, holding the cream jug. "No milk," he said. Then he seemed to hear a noise, and looked keenly through the doorway. "Happen we'd better shut it," he said, nodding at the door. "It seems a pity," she replied. "Nobody will come, will they?" "Not unless it's 1 time in 1,000, but you never know." "But it's no matter, it's only a cup of tea." She paused. "Are you sad today?" "Sad? No. Bored. I had to go getting summonses for 2 poachers I caught, and, oh well, I don't like people," he said with anger. "Do you hate being a gamekeeper?" "No, so long as I'm left alone. But I have to go messing around at the police station and waiting for a lot of fools to attend to me. Well, I get mad." He smiled. "I've got to work or I should die. I'm not in good enough temper to work for myself. It's got to be a sort of job for somebody else. So altogether I'm very well off here, especially lately." "I'm going away for a while next month," she said, "to Venice for a month or so. Clifford won't go. He hates travel in his condition." "Aye, poor devil," he said with sympathy. There was a pause. "You won't forget me when I'm gone, will you?" she asked. He looked at her. "Forget," he said. "You know nobody forgets." She responded in a mute kind of voice. "I told Clifford I might have a child." He looked up at her, intense and searching. "You did? What did he say?" "Oh, he wouldn't mind. He'd be glad, really, so long as it seemed to be his." He was silent a long time. At last he said, "No mention of me, of course." "No, no mention of you. I said I might have a love affair in Venice." "You might," he replied slowly. "So that's why you're going?" "Not to have a love affair," she said. "Just the appearance of one, then," he commented. There was a silence. Suddenly he asked, "That was why you wanted me, then? To get a child?" She hung her head. "No, not really." "Well, it's as your ladyship likes. If you get the baby, Sir Clifford's welcome to it. I shan't have lost anything. On the contrary, I've had a very nice experience. If you've made use of me, it's not the first time I've been made use of." "But I didn't make use of you," she pleaded. "I liked your body." "Did you?" he replied, laughing. "Well then, we're quits. because I liked yours. Would you like to go upstairs now? No, not here. At the hut, I must go. He said nothing. She went down the path, and he stood in the doorway, faintly grinning. She was divided between two feelings, resentment against him, and a desire to make it up with him. After tea, she could neither sit nor stand. She would have to go back to the hut. If he was not there, all well and good. She slipped out of the side door. When she came to the clearing, she was terribly uneasy. But there he was again. She went straight to him. "Shall us go with the hut?" he asked. "Do you want me?" she asked, not mistrusting him. "Ah, if you want." She was silent for a moment, then went with him to the hut. Cold and derisive, her mind stood apart. Though she lay still, her impulse was to escape the man's ugly grip. His body seemed a foolish, imperfect thing, and yet when he had finished, she began to weep. At first he seemed to take no notice, but the storm inside her swelled and shook her, shaking him. "Aye," he said softly, "it was no good that time. You wasn't there." Her sobs became violent. "But what's amiss?" he went on. I can't love you," she sobbed. "Well, dinna fret. There's no law says that that's got to. Take it for what it is." She wept bitterly. "But I want to love you, and I can't. It seems horrid." He laughed a little, half bitter, half amused. "It isn't horrid," he said. "Dinna fret thysen about loving me. Thou must take the rough with the smooth." At that instant she hated his dialect. Yet as he was drawing away to rise silently and leave, she clung to him in terror. "Don't go, don't leave me, don't be cross with me, hold me," she whispered, clinging to him. He took her in his arms again and drew her to him. Her resistance was gone, and she began to slide into a marvellous peace. She felt herself melting in the flame of desire, and she let herself go. Her terror subsided. She dared to let everything relax, every part of herself. It seemed she felt like the sea. At first nothing but dark waves, rising and heaving with a dead swell, but with the ebbing of the tide she realized all her loveliness. Her body clung with tenderness to the unknown man. "It was so lovely," she moaned this time. But he said nothing, only softly kissing her, lying still above her. When awareness of the outside began to filter back, she clung to his breast, murmuring, "My love, my love." He held her silently, with a silence that was fathomless. "Where are you?" she whispered to him. "Speak to me. Say something to me." He kissed her softly, whispering, "I'm a lass." But she did not know what he meant. In his silence he seemed lost to her. "You love me, don't you?" she murmured. "Aye, thou knowst," he said. "But tell me," she pleaded. "Say you'll always love me." "Aye," he said abstractedly. She felt her questions driving him away from her. "Must we get up?" he asked at last. "No," she said. But she could feel his consciousness straying, listening to the noises outside. "It'll be nearly dark," he said. She kissed him. He rose, turned up the lantern, and quickly pulled on his clothes. He stood there above her, looking down at her with dark, wide eyes, his face a little flushed and his hair ruffled. It made her want to hold him again, for there was a warm, half-sleepy remoteness in his beauty that made her want to cry out and clutch him, to have him. But she knew she would never have him. "You do believe I love you?" she asked. "You love me just now, but who knows what'll happen once I starts thinking about it." "No, don't say those things." "Ah, well," he said. "This what best." She lay still as he softly opened the door to let in the dark blue sky. He went out to shut up the hens. She remained where she was and wondered. A little later he returned, and she agreed to visit him on Sunday. As she ran home in the twilight, the world seemed a dream. The trees in the park and the slope to the house seemed alive. On Sunday, Clifford wanted to go to the wood, It was a lovely morning. It was cruel for him, while the world blossomed, to have to be helped from his chair to the bath chair. Connie still suffered, having to lift his inert legs into place. As they passed the front of Ragby Hall, Clifford remarked, "I hope I can have some repairs done to the old place next year. I think I shall have about 1,000 to spare for that. Such work costs so much." "Oh, good," said Connie, "as long as there aren't more strikes." "What would be the use of their striking again? Merely ruin what's left of the industry." "Perhaps they don't mind ruining the industry," replied Connie. "Ah, don't talk like a woman. The industry fills their bellies, even if they can't keep their pockets quite so flush. There'll be no more strikes if the thing is properly managed." "But will the men let you?" Connie asked. "We shan't ask them. We shall do it while they're not looking, for their own good, to save the industry. I can live without the pits, but they can't. They'll starve if there are no pits, but I've got to make other provisions." "But will the men let you dictate terms?" asked his wife. "My dear," replied Clifford, "they'll have to, if one does it gently. They realise that the industry comes before the individual. Somebody's got to be the boss of the show." "But who is the boss of the show?" she asked. "The men who own and run the industries." There was a long silence. At last Connie said, "It seems to me they're a bad boss. They don't take their position seriously enough." "They take it far more seriously than you take your ladyship," Clifford retorted. "That's thrust on me. I don't really want it," she blurted out. "Ah, but that's just funk. You've got it, you're fated to it, and you should live up to it. Who has given the colliers all they have that's worth having? Who's given it to them? Have the colliers given it to colliers? No. All the Ragbys and Shipleys in England have given their part and must go on giving. There's your responsibility." Connie listened and flushed very red. "I'd like to give something," she said, "but I'm not allowed to. Everything must be sold and paid for now. Everything must be sold at a good profit. You don't feel one heartbeat of real sympathy for them. And besides, who has taken away from these people their natural life and given them this industrial horror? Why is Teversham so ugly, so hideous? Why are their lives so hopeless? They built their own Teversham. That's part of their display of freedom. They live their own pretty lives in their own pretty Teversham. I can't live their lives for them." "But you make them work for you. They live the life of your coal mine." "Not at all," responded Sir Clifford. "Not one man is forced to work for me." "Their lives are industrialised and hopeless, and so are ours," Connie cried. "I don't think they are. You don't look at all a hopeless figure standing there, Connie, my dear." Which was true. She looked full of rebellious passion, far from dejected hopelessness. She wondered with rage why it was she felt Clifford was so wrong, yet she could not explain exactly why he was wrong. "No wonder the men hate you," she remarked. "They don't," he replied, "and don't fall into the trap of mistaking the sense of the word. They're not men, they're animals you don't understand and never could. Don't thrust your illusions on other people. What we need to take up now is ships, not swords. The masses have been ruled since time began, and till time ends, ruled they will have to be. It's sheer hypocrisy and farce to say they can rule themselves." "But can you rule them?" she asked. "I? Oh, yes. Neither my mind nor my will is crippled. I can do my share of ruling. Give me a son, and he will be able to rule his portion after me." "But he wouldn't necessarily be your own son, of your own ruling class," she stammered. "I don't care who his father is, as long as he is a healthy man, not below normal intelligence. I'll make a perfectly competent Chatterley of him. When it comes to expressive or executive functions, I believe there is a gulf, an absolute one between the ruling and serving classes. The two functions are opposites, and it is the function that determines the individual." Connie looked at him with dazed eyes. He'd had his say. Now he lapsed into his peculiar, rather vacant apathy that Connie found so trying. In the wood, anyway, she was determined not to argue. They passed the narrow track to the hut. Thank heaven it was not wide enough for the chair. The chair reached the bottom of the slope and swerved round, only to disappear. Connie heard a low whistle behind her. She glanced sharply round. The keeper was striding downhill towards her. "Is Sir Clifford going to the cottage?" he asked. "No, only to the well." "Ah, good. Then I'll keep out of his sight. But I'll see you tonight. I shall wait for you at the park gate about 10. He stared directly into her eyes. "Yes," she faltered. She looked at him, frightened, and started running down the hill, cooing again to Clifford. The man above watched her, then turned, grinning faintly, back onto his path. Connie found Clifford close to the well. How silent and gloomy it seemed there. "Will you have a drink?" Clifford asked Connie. "Will you?" She took an enamel mug from a twig on a tree and stooped to fill it for him. He drank in sips. Then she stooped again and drank a little herself. "It's icy," she said, gasping. "Good, isn't it? Did you make a wish?" "Yes, I wished. But I'm not telling you what." Then they started on the return journey. The chair balked, then stopped a little way up the slope. In exasperation, Clifford sounded his horn for Mellors. The keeper appeared immediately and examined the engine. "There's certainly nothing obvious broken," he remarked. Clifford started the motor again, which seemed to go better this time. "If I give her a push, she'll do it by herself." He kept fiddling with his engine. Suddenly the chair charged forward, and with a sick lurch sideways tumbled into the ditch. "Clifford!" cried Connie, rushing forward. But the keeper had already got hold of the chair by the rail, pushing from behind as the chair now chugged up the hill. "You see, she's doing it!" exclaimed Clifford, victorious, glancing over his shoulder. He saw the keeper's face. "You pushing her? She won't do it without." "Let her alone! I asked you to let me try," demanded Clifford. The keeper stood back and the chair stopped. Clifford, seated, a prisoner, was white with vexation. She would not budge. He stopped the engine and sat rigid with anger. Connie sat on the bank, remembering some of her husband's words. "What we need to take up now is whips, not swords, the ruling classes." The keeper strode up, then lay on his stomach and examined the engine. "Try her again," he said patiently, quietly. Clifford tried her. She was going once more. Mellors stepped behind and began to push. Clifford glanced round, yellow with anger. "Look, you! Get off there!" The man pulled back. He'd finished. The chair began slowly to run backwards. The two onlookers rushed forward. The chair now stood still. "I expect she'll have to be pushed," agreed Clifford at last. There was no answer. "Do you mind pushing her home, Mellors?" he ordered, in a cool, superior tone. "I hope I've said nothing to offend you." "Nothing at all, Sir Clifford," Mellors replied. But the brake was stuck. Mellors pulled at the wheel. At last the brake gave and the chair reeled. "For God's sake!" cried Clifford in terror. The keeper put a stone under the wheel, then sat on the bank, his face white from the effort. Connie looked at him and almost cried with anger. There was dead silence. "Have you hurt yourself?" she asked. "No, no," he turned away irritably. At last he sighed, blew his nose and said, "That pneumonia took a lot out of me." No one answered. He rose and took the handle of the chair. He was paler than Connie had ever seen him, and more distant, but she helped him push. It was surprisingly hard work. She looked at his hands, browned by the weather. Shoving with his left hand, he laid his right hand on her round white wrist, caressing it. She bent suddenly and kissed his hand. Meanwhile, the back of Clifford's head was held, sleek and motionless, just in front of them. As they paused at the top of the hill, Connie realized for the first time that she had consciously and definitely hated Clifford with a vivid hate, as if he ought to be obliterated from the face of the earth. "Now I've hated him, I shall never be able to go on living with him," was the thought that crossed her mind. When they reached the house, both she and Mellors wiped the perspiration from their faces. It was curious, but their work together had brought them much closer than they had been before. "Thank you so much, Mellors," said Clifford at the house door. Mellors slung his arms back into his jacket, looked directly at Connie, saluted, and was gone. Connie, furious, went upstairs. At lunch she could not contain her feelings. "Why are you so abominably inconsiderate, Clifford?" she asked. "Of whom?" "Of the keeper. If that was an illustration of what you call the ruling classes, I'm sorry for you. There's a man who's been ill and isn't strong. My word, if I were one of the working classes, I'd let you wait for service. I'd let you whistle. I can quite believe that. If he'd been sitting in a chair with paralyzed legs and behaved as you behaved, what would you have done for him?" "My dear evangelist," replied Clifford, "this confusing of persons and personalities is in bad taste. And your nasty, sterile want of common sympathy is in the worst taste imaginable. Noblesse oblige, you and your ruling class." "I pay him £2 a week and give him a house for his services," argued Clifford. "Pho, I would tell you to keep your £2 a week and your house," responded Connie with emphasis. "Probably he would like to, but can't afford the luxury." "You rule," went on Connie. "You don't rule. Don't flatter yourself. Why, you're all dried up. You only bully with your money. I was utterly ashamed of you out there in the wood. Why, my father is 10 times the human being you are, you gentleman." Clifford rang the bell for Mrs. Bolton. He was yellow at the gills. Connie went up to her room, furious, saying to herself, buying people. Well, he doesn't buy me. There's no need for me to stay with him. Dead fish of a man with his celluloid soul. Meanwhile, the Venus of Stack's Gate has established herself, claiming the cottage as her home. I repeat only this from hearsay, emanating from our own turkey buzzard, Mrs. Bolton. I would not have repeated it had she not exclaimed, "Her ladyship would go no more to the wood if that woman's going to be about." The news affected Connie with a sense of vexation amounting to exasperation. Now she had to be bothered by that beast of a woman. She'd had no letter from Mellors, for they had agreed not to write, although now she wanted to hear from him personally. After all, he was father of the child that she was expecting. But how hateful. Now everything was messed up. She did not mention the fact of her pregnancy even to Hilda. She wrote to Mrs. Bolton for exact information and received a reply which confirmed Mellors' position as outlined by Clifford. This was a nasty blow for Connie. Here she was, certain of life, now trapped in a snare of lowness and dirt. She felt angry with Mellors for ever having married Bertha Coates. It would be just as well to be rid of him, clear of him altogether. He was probably really common, really low. She felt revulsion about the whole affair. If Clifford knew about it, it would be unspeakably humiliating. She was afraid, terrified of society, and this, its unclean bite. She almost wished she could get rid of the child, and then everything would be quite clear. Then she experienced a revulsion in the opposite direction. She imagined she heard his voice again, and warmth run through her again. Oh no, she thought. I mustn't go back on it. I must stick to him, and what I'd thought of him despite everything. I had no warmth in my life until he gave it to me, and I won't go back on it. Then she did a rash thing. She sent a letter to Ivy Bolton, enclosing a note to the keeper, and asking Mrs. Bolton to give it to him. A few days later, a letter came from Clifford. He was evidently upset. I'm delighted to hear you're preparing to leave Venice on the 16th. But please don't hurry home on my account. It is essential that you get your full quota of sunshine. Here, even today, it rained. Besides, I am admirably looked after by Mrs. Bolton. The scandal of the keeper continues and gets larger, snowballing, when I hear Mrs. Bolton talk. As a result, I feel myself plunging down to the depths, where the fish of human secrets wriggle and swim. I fear we're going to lose our gamekeeper. The scandal of the truant wife, instead of dying down, has revived to greater and greater dimensions. The trouble is that Bertha Coates has not confined herself to her own experience and sufferings. She claims she has discovered that her husband has been keeping women down at the cottage, and has already had a few random shots at naming the woman at the top of her voice. An injunction has now been taken out against her. I've had an interview with Mellors about the whole business. He goes about as usual. I told him it was a nuisance to have the woman trespassing, to which he replied that he had no power to arrest her. I asked him if it was true that he entertained ladies down at the cottage, and all he said was, "Why, what's that to you, Sir Clifford?" As an example of impertinence, he'd be hard to beat. He made no trouble about leaving at the end of next week. I told him I'd give him a month's wages extra when he left. He said he'd rather I kept my money, as I'd no reason to ease my conscience. Indeed, he went on, "You don't owe me nothing extra, Sir Clifford, so don't pay me nothing extra. If you think you see my shirt hanging out, just tell me." The irritation and lack of sympathy evident in Clifford's letter had a bad effect on Connie, but she understood better when she heard from Mellors. The cat is out of the bag, along with various other kittens. My wife Bertha, as you've heard, broke in and found one of your books with your name on the front page. For some days she went round loudly saying that my paramour was no less a person than Lady Chatterley herself. Sir Clifford and the rector proceeded to take legal steps against my wife, who, for her part, disappeared, having always had a mortal fear of the police. Sir Clifford asked to see me, and told me that her ladyship's name had been mentioned in the scandal. He said it was a great insult to him. He as good as told me that I was a disreputable character, who walked about with my breeches buttons undone, and I as good as told him he at least had nothing to unbutton anyhow. So he gave me the sack. I shall go to London to my old landlady, Mrs. Inger, at 18 Coburg Square, who will either give me room or will find one for me. From this, be sure your sins will find you out, especially if you're married and your wife's name's Bertha. There was not a word about herself, or to her. Connie resented this, but she knew he was leaving her free. She was angry, but did not know what to do or what to say. So she said and did nothing. At last she wrote to Mellors at the London address, asking him to send her a letter to Hartland's Hotel and to call for her on the Monday evening at 7, following her arrival from Venice in 8 days' time. As they travelled back, her father said to Connie, "Won't it be a little dull for you going back to Ragby?" "I'm not sure I shall ever go back to Ragby," she replied. "Why not?" he asked. "I'm going to have a child." "But not Clifford's child, surely?" "No, another man's." "But what are your plans?" "I don't know. Clifford told me after the last time you talked to him he wouldn't mind if I had a child, so long as I went about it discreetly." "So, you can present Clifford with an heir to all the Chatterleys and put another baronet in Ragby." Sir Malcolm smiled. "But I don't think I want to." "My child, privately we can please ourselves. You may like this man this year and another next, for emotions change, but Ragby still stands. You'll get very little from making a break. But you can make a break if you wish. You have an independent income, although you won't get much out of it. Put a little baronet in Ragby. It's an amusing thing to do." Sir Malcolm sat back and smiled. Connie was silent. "I hope you had a real man at last," he said to her after a while. "I did. That's the trouble. There aren't many of them about," she said. "No, by God," he mused, "there aren't. Well, my dear, he was a lucky man. Surely he wouldn't make trouble for you?" "Oh, no, he leaves me entirely my own mistress." Quite, a genuine man would." Sir Malcolm was pleased with his favourite daughter, and he'd always disliked Clifford. He saw her to Hartland's Hotel and left her alone there. She found a letter from Mellors. "I won't come round to your hotel, but I'll wait for you outside the Golden Cock in Adam Street at 7. There he stood, tall and slender and so different, in a formal suit. He could go anywhere. With a woman's instinct for happiness, Connie registered it at once. "I'm happy now he's here." "Was it unpleasant for you?" she asked. "People are always unpleasant. I knew I was a fool to be kind." "And did you miss me?" "I was glad you were out of it," he replied. "I'm going to have a child." He looked at her with darkened eyes. "Say you're glad," she pleaded. "It's the future," he said. "And I'm such a terrible mistress to the future." "But you needn't worry about having any responsibility for it. Clifford would have it as his own. He'd be glad." She saw him go pale and recoil. "You wouldn't have to tell him who the father was?" he asked at last. "Oh," she answered, "he'd take it even then, if I wanted him to." "Aye, I suppose he would." Again there was silence, a big gulf between them. "What do you want yourself?" Mellors asked her eventually. "I want to live with you. You've got more than most men, and you know it. In any case, why offer anything? It's not a bargain," she continued. "It's just that we love one another." Nay, it's more than that. A man must offer a woman some meaning in his life, if it's going to be an isolated life, and if she's a genuine woman. I can't be just your male concubine. The money's yours, the position's yours, the decisions will lie with you." "Is that why you're afraid of me?" she asked. "Yes, it's the money really, and the position. It's the worldliness you have." "But isn't there any tenderness in me?" she added wistfully. He looked at her closely. "Aye, lass, comes and goes like it do with me." "But you can't trust it between you and me?" His face softened. "Maybe," he said. That night, she was quite determined that there should be no parting between him and her. He told her his divorce would be final the next March. "But the baby will probably be born at the end of February," she said. He was silent and then said, "It ought to be allowed to shoot the Cliffords and Berthas. Their souls must be awful inside 'em." Connie now had plenty to think of. She had to live alone until spring. She confided in her father. Sir Malcolm was angry, for he could not bear the scandal of his daughter having an affair with a gamekeeper. Not that he minded the affair, he minded the scandal. Hilda arrived, also furious when she heard of the new developments, and she too simply could not stand the thought of a public scandal concerning her sister and a gamekeeper. It was too humiliating. If Connie was going to be with the man, she'd better be able to marry him. This was Hilda's opinion. Sir Malcolm wasn't so sure. He hoped the affair might still blow over. Connie reconsidered and made a new plan, that she persuade Duncan Forbes, an artist, and one of the party with her in Venice, to pose as the father of her child. Sir Malcolm agreed to the proposal, having seen Mellors, and approved of his forthright character. So Connie arranged for a dinner between Mellors and Duncan Forbes, where the matter was settled on condition that Connie pose for the artist. Connie wrote to Clifford, "I'm afraid what you foresaw has happened. I really am in love with another man, and so hope you will divorce me. I am staying at present with Duncan in his flat. I told you he was in Venice with us. I'm awfully unhappy for your sake, but do try to take it quietly. I can't bear to come back to Ragby. I'm awfully sorry. Do try to forgive me. Divorce me and find someone better. I'm not really the right person for you. I'm too impatient and too selfish, I suppose. Do forgive me and get rid of me." Clifford was not inwardly surprised to get this letter. He'd known deep down for some time that she was thinking of leaving him, although he had absolutely refused to accept any outward admission of it. Therefore, externally, it came as the most terrible blow and shock to him. He was like a hysterical child, and gave Mrs. Bolton a terrible fright by sitting upright in bed looking ghastly and blank. "Sir Clifford," she cried, "you're ill. I must send for the doctor." There was a pause. Then the hollow voice said, "I'm not ill. My wife isn't coming back." He handed her the letter. She read it. "Well, I am surprised at her ladyship," she said. "She promised so faithfully she'd come back." She began to weep. Tears also began to fill Clifford's eyes and run down his cheek. He was weeping for himself. "Now, don't fret, Sir Clifford," said Mrs. Bolton, wiping her cheeks. "You'll only do yourself an injury." He put his arms round her and clung to her like a child. At length she kissed him and rocked him like a child. Yet while she triumphed in her care of him, so she kept that corner of her weird female soul which despised and hated him. She despised him with a savage contempt that knew no bounds. The merest tramp was better than he. His behaviour regarding Connie was curious, for he insisted on seeing her again, on her coming back to Ragby. Mrs. Bolton opposed him no more. She understood what she was dealing with. Clifford wrote to Connie, asking her to return to talk things over. Connie showed this letter to Mellors. "He wants to begin his revenge on you," he said. "What shall I do?" she asked. "Nothing." She tried to put Clifford off. He answered, "If you don't come back to Ragby now, I shall still consider that you are coming back one day. I shall just go on in the same way and wait for you here, even if I have to wait for 50 years. She was frightened. This was bullying of an insidious sort. She had no doubt he meant what he said. After a period of continuous worry and harassment, she decided to return to Ragby Hall. Hilda would go with her. And so they went to Ragby. Clifford was away when they arrived. Connie entered the house, which he now hated with every fibre of her body. She was no longer its mistress, she was its victim. They did not meet Clifford till the evening. There was tension after coffee, when Hilda went up to her room. Clifford and Connie sat in silence when she had gone. Neither would begin to speak. "I suppose you don't mind at all having gone back on your word?" he asked at last. "I can't help it," she murmured. He looked at her with cold rage. How dare she? Then he spoke again. "You still have to convince me of the importance of the change. I don't believe your love for Duncan Forbes is real." "Why should you have to believe in it? You have only to divorce me. Anyway, I don't want to live here any more. For my part, since you are my wife, I should prefer that you stayed under my roof in dignity and quiet. Leaving aside personal feelings, it is almost as bitter as death for me to have the order of life here at Ragby broken up, just to pander to some whim of yours." After another period of silence, she said, "I can't help it. I'm expecting a child." He too was silent for a time. "And is it for the child's sake you must go?" he asked at length. She nodded. He continued, "But really? I want my wife, and I see no reason for letting her go. The child is welcome under my roof, provided that the decency and order of our life is preserved." "But don't you see," said Connie, "I must go away from you, and I must live with the man I love. No, I don't see. I don't give tuppence for your love, or for the man you are supposed to love, Duncan Forbes. You're too intelligent to believe in your own love for him, so why should I be fooled by such nonsense? She felt he was right there. Because it isn't Duncan that I do love, she said. We only said Duncan to spare your feelings, because the man I really love, and it'll make you hate me, is Mellors, who was our gamekeeper. Clifford's face went suddenly yellow, and his eyes bulged as he glared at her. He leant forward. My God, you ought to be wiped off the face of the earth. That scum, that bumptious lout. And you mean to say that you want to have a child by a wretch like that? Yes, I'm going to. He was speechless. It was obvious he couldn't accept the existence of Mellors in any connection with his own life. His look was one of sheer, unspeakable, impotent hate. And do you mean to say you'd marry him, and bear his foul name? He asked at length. Yes, that's what I want. So don't you think you'd better divorce me and have done with it? Connie replied. No. You can go where you like, but I shan't divorce you, and I care nothing about the child. Would you even let the child, if a boy, inherit your title and have Ragby? She asked. I care nothing about that. But you must, for I shall prevent the child from being legally yours if I can. Do as you like. Clifford was immovable. It was useless. Connie went upstairs and told Hilda what had happened. They decided to leave the following day for Scotland. Mellors went into the country and got work on a farm. The idea was he would get his divorce, if possible, whether or not Connie got hers, and for 6 months he should work at farming, so that eventually he and Connie could have some small farm of their own, into which he could put his energy. He wrote to Connie at the end of September from Grange Farm, saying of the people thereabouts, The Colliers are a sad lot, a deadened lot to me. Dead to their women, dead to life. The young ones scoot about all right, but inside they're very dead. The mind needs money, and money poisons you when you got it, and starves you when you haven't. But I'm sure you're sick of all this. I don't want to harp on about myself, as I've nothing happening to me. I don't like to think much about you, for that only makes a mess of us both. Of course, what I live for now is for you and me to live together. I'm frightened, really, for I feel that devil Mammon in the air, and he'll try and get to us. There's a bad time coming. You can't insure against the future except by really believing in the best bit of you, and in the power beyond it. So, I believe in the little flame between us, as it's the only thing in the world left for me. It's my Pentecost. Patient. Be always patient. Now, I love being chased. I love it as snowdrops of the snow. It's like fresh water and rain to me now. Well, I write so many words because I can't touch you. But we have to be separate for a while. And I suppose it really is the better way. If only one could be sure. But never mind, never mind. We won't get worked up about it. We'll trust our little play.